Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt at the Oracle. Welcome to the sixth episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Last week, we explored the applicability of poker to DFS. This week, we're going to talk about the impact of late-breaking NBA news on your DFS decisions. Let's get started. Our guest for this week is Spencer Limbach on Twitter at Spencer_JL. He's a DFS writer and editor for RotoWorld, and he also contributes fantasy content to FanDuel, The Fake Basketball, and Daily Fantasy Cafe. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Pretty excited to do this.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. We spoke last during college football season. I was on your show, so it's nice to have you back on this one.
Yeah, returning the favor for you here. So hopefully I can live up to the content you provided on our show. So some big shoes to fill there, but I'll try.
It may be big shoes, but a pretty low bar. So I think we'll be fine. All right, great to have you on. And returning to the show is Jay Persson at Doppel Sykes. He's a writer for FantasyLabs and an all-around degenerate. Jay, how have the Bobon Labs been treating you?
Well, we moved on from the Bobon Labs now, but yeah, everything else is good. I'm still a huge degen, and I'm excited to be back on this pod after, I think, the first one. So good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. I think you were supposed to be on when you guys were on your road trip in Colorado, but I think somehow you were prevented from appearing on that show.
Yeah, some things came up, and yeah.
Yeah, so Brian did a good job of filling in, but it's good to have you on the show. And then finally, also returning to the roundtable is Adam Levitan on Twitter at Adam Levitan. He's a DraftKings analyst, co-host of the Daily Fantasy Football Edge podcast, a FantasyLabs writer, and a two-time FSWA award winner. Adam, tell us why the 76ers sucking right now is actually a good thing.
Listen, I'm feared that they've taken the tank off. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen The Big Short, but like the worst possible thing you can do is like establish a plan and have it be working to really smart people and then like get pressure from outside people and give it up. So this whole Colangelo thing really scares me. Like, I do not want them taking the tank off. I do not want them like acquiring Dennis Schroeder for whatever. You know what I mean? I think that they should continue the tank and continue on the path that we've set, 2020, 21 NBA champions.
All right. Awesome. I look forward to that passion right there continuing into the show. It's great to have you on. Let's jump into it. So the NBA is unlike a lot of other sports in that relevant and impactful news is often released shortly before game time. In the NFL, game day inactives are declared well in advance. In MLB, the lineups are usually available hours before the game. The pitching rotation is dependable. In NBA, so much can change the half hour prior to tip-off. And the impact of late-breaking news can be pretty big because the connection between opportunity and fantasy production is fairly high. So, Spencer, let's start with you. I think the first question is, how do you attempt to minimize the impact of late-breaking NBA news? How do you attempt to account for news that might break even before it actually breaks?
I think you just have to be prepared even way before that last hour heading into lineup lock. And most of that starts with overnight news. Maybe there's an injury situation that happened late the night before that a coach commented on after the game, or a lot of teams like to hold around noon or 1 p.m. Eastern time, and we usually get some injury information around then, at least just telling us if people are questionable, if someone has the flu, if they're sick, things like that. So we can be a little bit cognizant of potential injury situations even before they crop up when we get definitive words. So if you take those and just weigh the scenarios, if a certain player is in, out, what's going to happen, just be prepared, be ahead of the curve there. So when that news does break, you're ready to just take action and you know exactly what you want to do if that happens.
Yeah, I think a team to look at, the Kings often release an injury report the night before. The Bucks usually write up something late at night. So we definitely have clues on it. But I think it's really something that kind of develops throughout the season. Especially now where we're kind of pretty far in the season. You can anticipate coaches resting players or teams possibly tanking, hopefully Adam's Sixers. You can always look at schedules to kind of get a feel on when certain guys could potentially sit. An example of that is with Randy Whitman and kind of the Wizards. They've sat Nene on back-to-backs. They've sat Beal on back-to-backs earlier this season. Now he's crippled. We'll probably never see him again. Allen Anderson's been sitting on some back-to-backs. So you kind of predict which players have a higher chance to sit and plan your research around that. We have Popovich, obviously, every now and then who pops us, but he's actually been a lot better. That hasn't happened as frequently this year. We have Rick Carlisle, who has rested some of his guys, but not so much lately. They're kind of playing down the stretch. You had Parsons getting fully strength back, and Wes Matthews as well. So now we see these guys. So I think keeping up with coaches' tendencies is really important and overlooked as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to I love late breaking news. I think that is one of our biggest edges. And you guys that are watching this podcast, if you're putting the time in to watch the pod and follow everything, it's a huge edge. Like the other night when Memphis did what they did, sitting 4 or 5 starters, it's just a massive edge to people that are paying attention. I mean, I had people locked in head-to-heads that clearly were not paying attention whatsoever, had 0 Grizzlies on their roster, and really had 0 shots. So it's just a huge edge to be aware of it. I think in terms of preparing beforehand, understanding the team's roster completely. So when Memphis news breaks, my first thought is Mario Chalmers and J. Michael Green. And I don't have to go through and think who the hell is J. Michael Green? I've already followed this guy, even though he's been on the bench all year. So I think, learning and understanding guys on the roster that are fantasy viable all the way down to the 8th or 9th guy helps a lot.
Jay, I have a follow-up question on this. So you're saying that this is a situation that kind of develops throughout the season where you start to get a sense of how things might go, how certain teams operate. What are the situations of uncertainty that you monitor throughout the day and that you feel, I guess, more comfortable with? The situations in which you have an inclination of how things might go versus the uncertain situations where you still really don't have much of an idea how something might break?
Yeah, it's tough. I think there are multiple layers to this question, actually, in that I think risk tolerance plays a huge role as well. If you're a cash player or a tournament player, it can kind of go both ways. So there's definitely an advantage to be had in how to gather information on uncertain players. Adam actually tweeted a link earlier today that hinted at Vucevic being closer to doubtful than questionable. And, we can utilize this information to possibly rate Jason Smith higher, even Evan Fournier and Victor Oladipo as well. So, without 100% certainty, me personally, I wasn't comfortable enough to go Jason Smith in cash on FanDuel, but I definitely look at these situations, and you can definitely go him on FanDuel in tournaments, and then on DraftKings, you can obviously go ahead and throw Jason Smith in your utility since it's the late game. So having that option to do that and taking it site by site can be a huge advantage. So really the things you look at beforehand can be anything from the type of injury, the history of the player. You got Eric Gordon, the Brad Beal guys who are injury prone. You can look at, all the information we can possibly get, whether it's from I've seen a Vine posted by a beat writer who's at the game and gotten information from that on how they look when they're warming up. You can get a jump. You can read articles with quotations from the coach or the player. Did the player participate in shoot around that day? Anything to kind of sway the questionable tag to more probable or doubtful. And basically anything that we can use to help predict the player's status is a huge advantage here.
Adam, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I if there's any injury questions at all, I like to read through the papers, just something that I used to do at Roto World, just wake up and try to read every hometown newspaper. So if there's a question surrounding, let's say, the Spurs, I'll just type into the Google machine, San Antonio Express News Spurs, and read everything there. Or if there's a question surrounding, Cousins or Gay or something like that, I'll just type in Sac B Kings and read everything there. It's not like the NFL. Not every little bit of information is fully fleshed out and reported nationally. A lot of this is local because Nick Vucevic's status tonight against the Lakers really doesn't matter to that many people. Whereas, in football, if Lamar Miller, breaks a toenail or something, it's Adam Schefter is talking about it on SportsCenter. So, just a total difference there. I think that really getting to know the beat writers and reading what they have to say and coach comments like these guys already talked about is really important.
Spencer, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, they pretty much covered it, but one thing I kind of want to elaborate on, obviously everyone sitting at this round table is, very engrossed in daily fantasy and really likes to get down into it and everything. and I like to do that myself. But there are some casual players who may not have the time or the means to really decipher what's going on. And you shouldn't be ashamed on like relying on the experts for that. There's a lot of great content sites out there. I know FantasyLabs posts tweets, alerts, everything. Roto World has a full breakdown on, hey, this is the injury situation. He's questionable. If he's out, here are the people that are going to benefit. I mean, that's just a great way to learn is taking advice from people who have been doing it for a long time. And pretty soon, if you do that long enough, it'll just become second nature to you, and you'll really get to pick up the rotations, how to really look into things and what it means for potential plays.
All right, so late breaking news is just a fact of NBA DFS life, and it happens quite often that guys are scratched, not exactly at the last minute, but pretty close to last minute. Adam, are there particular positions that you think are more resilient in the face of late breaking news? So, for instance, if a starting point guard is scratched at the last minute, do you feel better starting his backup than if it were a small forward or a center who were scratched?
Yeah, sure. So generally speaking, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, is I feel way better about backup point guards than I do backup big men. I think the exception is when teams are so thinned out. Like we saw the Grizzlies only have 8 guys. We saw the Nets only have 8 guys. And like if Willie Reed is going to play 30 to 34 minutes, like, I don't know much about him. He is a big, but he's probably still going to be pretty decent and meet value. So yeah, like generally speaking, I think it's way easier for guards to step in and play well just because maybe not play well, but play well from a fantasy perspective because they have the ball in their hands so much, and that leads to fantasy points by themselves. The way they give out assists, just on the side note, is just a joke in the NBA. Like I was watching earlier tonight, like you could throw the ball to the wing, guy takes like 3 dribbles, spin move, fade away, and they give you an assist. So that helps the guards obviously a lot.
Jay, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree completely in that point guards. I generally find myself going more just because the points Adam mentioned there, they get assists, they have the ball in their hand more, but I don't necessarily think the positions matter overall as much as the depth at each position, which, differs from team to team. So Memphis was a great example, Brooklyn. While I do play more backup point guards and I'm more comfortable going them, I still look at, overall rotations and positional depth more than the actual position itself.
Spencer, I have a question here. So there are big news items that everyone realizes will have an impact, and then there are the smaller news items that people might overlook, but they could end up having a pretty substantial impact. So, for instance, maybe a backup is injured, and that means that the starter might get 38 minutes instead of 34 minutes or something like that. What are those smaller news items that people overlook but that you think could still have substantial impacts in slates?
Right. I mean, exactly what you said. I mean, some of those guys who people just skim over the headlines, like I think it happened the other night. Trevor Booker was out for Utah, and that meant, more secure playing time for a guy like Derek Favors. And even Trey Lyles off the bench had like 25 minutes and had a pretty good fantasy night. And, that's news that people oftentimes just overlook, dismiss, skim past through, and, don't really take it into consideration, but it's definitely relevant. I think especially on shorter slates, you should probably weigh that information more because you're just looking for any little edge you can get in making a player even better in his fantasy prospects. So definitely take all that into consideration. And really it comes down to, as we said before, just really knowing those rotations, knowing who that player backs up and what it means throughout the lineup.
Yeah, Trey Lyles is a great example for this one. That was a perfect scenario where you kind of saw some sharps that night have some exposure to Lyles, and you're like, wow, a lot of people overlook that. So I think this is something, definitely this topic that I didn't take into account enough back in the day when I was a young pup in DFS, but now you're really at a disadvantage if you just write off backups being ruled out. You really have to understand rotations. And out of all the things Justin here at FantasyLabs is good at, snowboarding not being one of them, he's exceptional at distributing minutes between all players and quickly adjusting any late scratches. So whether it's a starter or a backup. So on our Twitter feed, if we post something like, Luke Babbitt ruled out on Monday. All our mentions basically tell us how stupid we are and that it's a worthless tweet and we live worthless lives. But, even if he's projected at 3 minutes, those 3 minutes have to go somewhere. They don't just disappear. So, whether you give them to Dante Cunningham or whoever else, someone else is adding minutes, and 3 minutes can be a lot, and it's being added where it otherwise wouldn't. So, these types of situations I think can present huge advantages when you're creating lineups and looking at value other people don't notice.
In all fairness, we really might lead worthless lives, but it has absolutely nothing to do with what it is that we tweet out.
Yeah, no. First of all, push notifications to your phone are just like a must, and like I can keep up with everything without ever really opening, just like looking at my home screen on my phone, which is awesome. But yeah, to the point Spencer made before about not everybody having time to like read the Sacramento Bee, I totally understand that. Like, I obviously have like, this amazing job where that is kind of my job, is to read the Sacramento Bee about the Kings. And like, not everybody has that. I wouldn't be ashamed to just go off of Justin's minute projections. Like, he is on top of it like nobody else. And like, if you're wondering how many minutes X guy is going to get, I wouldn't be ashamed at all to just be like, hey, you know what? Forget the Sacramento Bee. I'm just going to go into the models and see how many Justin thinks X guy is going to get.
Let's see. Okay, I'm trying to find out where we are here on the outline. Okay, yes. How does Jay, let's go to you. How does the late breaking news alter your projections or expectations for players and lineups? And then do you build kind of contingency plans beforehand to take into account the possibilities of what might happen?
Yeah, so with a lot of players, we see a lot of players get questionable tags, which doesn't do much for us. It's very difficult. It's really hard to alter projections based on a questionable tag, whether you think it's, a gut feeling if this guy will sit or not. So we discussed this in the first few questions where you have to gather all the information possible to infer if a player will likely play or not. But it's really tough to actually change projections without anything concrete. So, with that said, you can definitely build contingency plans and take risks in predicting how developments will turn out if this questionable guy will be out. You want to plan if he's out. You want to plan if he's in. So I strongly recommend building contingency plans pretty much every night, and especially on nights where there are a lot of statuses hanging out. I mean, tonight was a good example. Vucevic being questionable. It was, I think, really important to build a contingency plan on him, which way he was leaning. So things like that, are all strong advantages here.
This is a question I get a lot on Twitter or through people DMing me, however it is that they contact me. They will say something like, so-and-so is expected to be out, but his minutes are, like normal starter minutes. Like how, and Jay, I guess this is probably a question more for Justin, but I think that you can probably answer it. How is it that we do projections for players that we are expecting to be out or potentially out? Do we just sort of go ahead as if we don't know yet what's going to happen and we are expecting that they will play close to full minutes? How is it that we take that into account?
So we have a pretty strict policy kind of on, if you're questionable, we're assuming, you got to keep the guy's minutes in there. And then if you're probable, you obviously have the minutes in there. If you're doubtful, we don't have the player in our model at all. So if anyone's doubtful, they're out. If they're questionable, but they haven't played in a while and they're probably leaning more doubtful, but they still have a questionable tag, we'll have them at 0 as well. And then, we're the first people to adjust when the news changes. Jordan Clarkson questionable, now he's doubtful. That will be reflected within, seconds really in the model. So status-wise, we do, questionable, they're still in the model, especially if they're just truly questionable. Like game time decisions, we just can't risk putting him at a 0 if he still has a chance to play. So that's kind of how that goes for us.
Mm-hmm. Adam, do you have any thoughts?
No, yeah. I mean, like, part of the job, I think, is to understand, like, who's on the good side of a questionable tag, et cetera. And Justin does a great job with that. But, yeah, you can't have a guy who might play, not be in the models, because that would just screw everything else up, if the guy ends up playing. So, yeah, I think it's a good policy to keep guys in there that are questionable.
Spencer, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think speaking to your point or your question about the projections and whatnot and how to really decipher that when one player is out, who is going to pick up those minutes if a starter is out. I think the best way to go about looking at that is, if it's possible, to see when that starter was out last time, what happened, what kind of lineups did they go with, who benefited the most. Sometimes we don't have that luxury where that player sat before, and sometimes external factors like a blowout, another starter being out, sometimes rule in there and can kind of throw those projections off. But I think that's a good starting point for really trying to understand who's going to benefit from a starter being out, because it's not always the guy who starts. Case in point tonight, Andre Miller, old man Andre, started for the Spurs and point guard with Tony Parker out. But he really wasn't the play. It was Patty Mills, or at least heading into that game. Patty Mills, who was, the higher fantasy point per minute guy who could come off the bench and really stand to benefit. So, just being aware of that and the rotations and like I said earlier, a lot of the people breaking these things down can help you out with that.
All right, so Adam, we've mentioned before DraftKings, the utility position is there. It can help people. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Can you talk about the way that you use that spot in your lineup? For instance, are there certain types of uncertain situations that won't be resolved until game time that you can handle with your utility spot? And then other situations that it really kind of doesn't matter, the utility spot won't help you at all?
Yeah. So two things, obviously we have late swap on DraftKings, and then we also have the utilities. So it's like we have so many more weapons at our disposal. And also for people that are really sharp and paying attention, I think that really tilts the kind of format in our favor. Like if we are on top of everything and we are on top of late swap and we are on top of using utility correctly, it's a huge edge. I find myself not rostering guys early. And I think tonight is an example. I thought Kyle Lowry was a really good play, but if I can go Jason Smith, then I can go John Wall or Damian Lillard. So in a normal situation, maybe on FanDuel, I play Lowry, but on DraftKings, I'm I can just leave my utility spot open for any position. And maybe it ends up being Jason Smith. If not, I go a different direction with any position, but then also it leaves me that upside to have Wall or Lillard, who I thought, were kind of a tier above Lowry. So yeah, I think that using guys in later games and just waiting, let's say there's a 7 o'clock game or a 7:30 game that you don't have much interest in. Maybe it's just meh. You can purposely not roster anybody from that game and just buy yourself another hour of time to gather more news. And on DraftKings, that could be super, super valuable. It also seems that you have no life because you want to sit around until 8 or 9 p.m. waiting for news to happen.
That's a good life, man. That's all we want. Yeah, I think late swap and utility is definitely advantageous, especially in both formats. Whether you're speaking cash or GPP. I kind of lean to where I like to utilize it more in GPPs. I like taking risks with my utility position with late swap. Kind of building your lineups with guys who are maybe questionable, I think you can get players at severely discounted ownerships, which is a huge advantage. So, really it's higher risk, higher reward with the late swap on the questionable tags.
Yeah, and this is kind of speaking to that point. It's a little bit obvious, but some beginners may not know this. To obviously organize your plays by the time that they're playing on DraftKings, because you want your guys who are in the later games to be in your guard, forward, and utility spots. So if something happens, if a better value opens up, you can swap those guys. You're not locked into the 7 o'clock plays in your utility spot, and then you're stuck with the point guard, and you just can't move off of these players that you already had. So it's an obvious point, but it's worth reiterating to someone who may not know.
All right, so Spencer, let's transition from DraftKings to FanDuel. They do not have a utility spot or a flex spot. Does that make it easier or harder to account for late breaking news? I guess maybe the question is, if you are the type of person who is on top of the situation, do you think that that format gives certain advantages that aren't available in DraftKings?
Well, I think it's harder from the point that you can tend to force things more, because on DraftKings you have a lot more flexibility. You can put a guy at utility. You can get another. I mean, if there's 3 value power forwards that you like, which sometimes comes up, you can go utility, forward, power forward. But on FanDuel, you can really only roster 2 of them. So finding the right two, getting that price combination, getting it to mesh with everything else that you're trying to do, and weighing all the opportunity cost along with it is a little bit trickier, in my opinion. So, I mean, you just don't have that flexibility to pivot like you do on DraftKings. And I think a lot of times people can kind of force it. Just got a boost in minutes, so they kind of force it in there, and they pivot off what's otherwise a pretty good lineup. I mean, I don't know how many times I've done that, and I was kicking myself heading into the late games because I had the lineup, but I was swayed by some late news, and I really didn't weigh all the opportunity cost and what it meant for the rest of my lineup just to put that value play in there. So that's the only difference that I really see, other than not having that late swap feature, obviously, to work with later on.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think accounting for late injuries, I think FanDuel is a lot easier, just in the terms of like it's easier to deal with because you have less options. You don't have to consider multiple positions to fill one roster spot. So, it's either easier to deal with. I think you have less of an advantage over your opponents because you're kind of like you can backups in and you just automatically kind of put them in or whatever. So it's easier to deal with, but less of an advantage because there'll be overlap. So I think with the utility spot option, you definitely get more rewarded if you are on top of everything and kind of have contingency plans for late news, and you have more creativity, more advantage over your opponents in that if you are following every piece of news, you can utilize that to have a one up on your opponent. So I think that's why we've seen so much overlap in NBA on FanDuel this season. So it's easier to deal with the actual late news, but probably harder in terms of beating a rake possibly. Like last night with the Grizzlies was a great example of overlap. The Grizzlies backups were in pretty much everybody's lineup, especially on FanDuel. We saw a lot of similar lineups because you just throw those Grizzlies guys in and then you just have one position to fill for other guys where everybody went to the same guy because it all fit.
Yeah, the big thing for me on FanDuel, and I think people make this mistake a lot, and tonight is an example, like Orlando is on a back-to-back. We already know about the Vucevic situation, but like, let's say I had Fournier projected 2 points higher than Zach Levine tonight. I would feel way more comfortable on FanDuel playing Levine, who was playing early and I know is active, than Fournier. It's like coming off of an injury last week or 2 weeks ago. And like, if I roster Fournier on FanDuel, I'm just kind of like sitting here with my fingers crossed that he actually plays. Whereas, as a raw projection, I thought Fournier was a little bit better, but Levine was safer because we know that he's actually playing. So if you're playing on FanDuel, I would really be worried about, or at least monitor guys who are on back-to-back, who you think at least have some outside chance of sitting. Like the 5% chance that Fournier sits tonight is scary enough for me to be like, God, I'm petrified. You know what I mean?
So Jay, I guess you've talked about this a little bit, but let's talk about it a little bit more. Given the differences between DraftKings and FanDuel, are there particular slates when you think that it might be better to play on one platform than another? So like the benefits of DraftKings are obvious. Are there ever slates when you look at it and you think, this might actually be more of a FanDuel slate because of this uncertainty?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it happens all the time. Sometimes I do get really exhausted with late news, especially now that I'm dealing with it in a more direct manner. So I'd say lately I find myself playing FanDuel a bit more. The late swap on DraftKings is such an advantage to utilize that if you aren't going to be fully available and checking constantly, it suddenly becomes a disadvantage. So if you have like a yoga class at 9 Eastern and they're a lot of questionable tags hanging out there, I'd probably recommend going lighter on DraftKings and, compared to FanDuel. So this doesn't mean you can't get burned on FanDuel though. Everybody runs into those brutal late scratches after lineup lock, but it's the same for everybody unless you kind of run bad. You just got to take it on your chin and move on to the next day.
Yeah, I mean, I think on certain slates, like given that you have to roster 2 small forwards and 2 shooting guards exactly on FanDuel, you can figure out nights where like certain guys are going to be 70-80% on FanDuel because you have to play 2 small forwards. There might only be like 3 small forwards in play in the entire slate. So that kind of sucks, but I like when I can project ownership. I mean, I'm not much of a tournament player, but like you knew tonight Kawhi and Melo would be like 70, 80, 90% owned, and you can easily make a strong contrarian lineup by just one fix, like putting Gordon Hayward in or something, or going outside the box a little bit more at small forward, and that would give you just a completely different lineup construction than everybody else. So, I understand people like to complain about the overlap on FanDuel, which I totally get, but I think that projecting ownership is just a huge, huge, huge edge if you're playing tournaments.
Yeah, and I'm kind of speaking to what Jay said a little bit earlier about possibly getting burned on FanDuel. That's the case now more than it has been all season. Heading into this last month of NBA, when you get that late news, people resting, even contenders and teams tanking, resting their players, you are going to get burned on FanDuel. I mean, it's going to come up sooner or later. You're going to have someone who gets a goose egg just because of that. I mean, my advice would be to just not get turned off because of it, because, I mean, sometimes it happens in your favor. You won't have a high-owned player that, has that goose egg, and then the cash game, the level the cash in double ups is lower. Geez, I could have said that a lot easier. So, yeah, I mean, just the psychology standpoint, we don't really talk about it a lot from DFS. We're so into our stats and into our projections. But, if you get that goose egg, a lot of people say, oh, man, when's MLB going to start? Come on. Like, I don't need this crap in NBA, a bunch of backups playing. But it's really exciting for me because people who are really plugged in and really know what's going on and kind of, see those backups getting more playing time can really have an edge.
All right, Adam, you mentioned earlier, maybe there are some slates where there are only, like 3 shooting guards or 3 small forwards, something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact of late-breaking news on large slates versus small slates and how that might impact the type of games you play, whether it's cash games or GPPs?
Yeah, that's interesting. When late-breaking news is happening, I'm typically not registering for games. So, like, I already kind of have my games all registered before the last 30 minutes. I will say that when I can project ownership and in that situations where I mentioned, if we could have projected exactly, that Carmelo and Kawhi were going to be hugely owned, I would throw in more GPP lineups than normal. But yeah, I don't know. Do you guys, as late news is breaking, I feel like not many people are like adjusting their slate for the night. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I never adjust for that. I usually have all my games registered by 1 or 2 o'clock, and just throwing out some contingency lineups and free rolls and stuff like that, or free head-to-heads, and then just kind of exporting from there if need be. So yeah, I'm definitely dedicating all that time to research and following up with the news and not registering for contests.
I wish we could. If I knew there was gonna be a ton of late news, I would triple my action because I would think that I would have a huge edge, but you just never know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a great answer because, sometimes you just can't predict how many late injuries and late news breaks. So, they both said you're already in all your games. I post the night before, generally get in games. I usually commit to if I'm going to just play tournaments the night before. So it's really hard to anticipate a lot of injuries. But if there is a slate where, there are a lot of statuses hanging out there, even in the late games, I think you can pump up your action because you're going to have an advantage over everyone else if you're on top of everything. So I think for late news tournaments are more, I think an advantage. You can take risks more often in cash, though. For early news, if you think they're going to be, right around lineup lock, a lot of them where some people can't deal with that, but you can, then I definitely think you can get your action up a little bit in cash games.
So a follow-up question on this, dealing more specifically with the differences between small slates and larger slates. It just kind of like mathematically, it seems like if you have the same number of uncertain scenarios in a smaller slate, there is, in a percentage manner, much more risk that you are encountering by playing in that slate. Can you talk about that difference just a little bit?
I'm not sure I caught it. Say that one more time.
Yeah, I probably said it really poorly. Let me try to rephrase that. So let's say if you have, 3 uncertain scenarios, major players who might or might not be playing in a smaller slate versus that same number in a larger slate. That smaller slate is much more impacted by the uncertainty that you are facing.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about that situation of how it is that you sort of mitigate risk in the smaller slates versus the larger slates?
Yeah, I think I follow what you're saying. On the larger slates, like, there's so many options that we can go to. Sometimes I'll like brush off a piece of late news, where on a smaller slate, like, you can't afford to do that at all. On a smaller slate, I feel like there's like a really narrow kind of lineup that I want to be on, or that I think is the correct lineup. On a larger slate, like, there's so many different ways that you can go. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I'm less swayed by certain late news that happens if the slate is larger.
Mm-hmm. Jay, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think I sway either way really on a large or small slate, depending on how many, if there's the same amount of total injuries. Obviously the percentage is different. So I think it's probably more impactful on a small slate. You have a guy like, if your main small forward or Kawhi or LeBron, for example, is the only guy you really have at small forward, he's questionable. He's not back-to-back. You don't know if Tyronn Lue's going to rest him. Then, it sways a lot, and I probably would lower my action if he's like the main piece of your team where you don't really have other options to go, and you kind of might not know in time. So whereas on a larger slate, you can pivot and you have a wider range of players to choose from.
All right, so guys, good show. We are going to go around the table one more time. Closing words of wisdom. Spencer, what do you think?
Yeah, just kind of like I said before, wrapping it all up is to look early and often at the injury news so you're ahead of that curve. And, spending less times going through your spreadsheet, going through projections once that news hits, and you know ahead of time exactly what to do. Exactly where you want to do it, building multiple lineups, contingency plans, if you will, just in case that injury hits. And one more thing, just don't be frustrated by the injury news, even if it works against you, particularly on FanDuel when you get that early lock. So just stay at it. You'll be on the right side of it next time. That's all I got.
Jay.
Yeah, Adam touched on it earlier, kind of like don't be afraid of the late news. It's just actually when I thrive. I want late news. I want to take advantage of these types of things. It helps you, build lineups in a quicker manner and have an edge on opponents. So my words of wisdom on this are to follow the FantasyLabs NBA account and you'll never miss anything. Refresh once before you go to sleep, refresh right when you wake up, and then literally do nothing the rest of the day except follow the feed. And that's the key to success.
That's not just following the Twitter feed. That's like following your dreams, literally your dream.
They're one in one. They're same thing.
All right, Adam, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, come on. We don't have to complain that NBA players are soft. Like, it's to our advantage that they're soft. We know that they're softer than they were in the 80s. Like, I love when people complain about NBA players sitting out so much. It's just the worst. So, yeah, I invite that. And really, like, the injury news is something that, like Jay said, I'm totally looking forward to, because I might not be the best talent evaluator or the best projector or everything, but I'll be damned if somebody has more news than me. And I think there's just like a huge edge that you can just be a winning player just by informationing our opponents. So, I think that's just like really, really, really important.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being on the show. We have been talking with Spencer Limbach, Jay Persson, and Adam Levitan. You can follow them on Twitter at Spencer_JL, Doppel Sykes, and Adam Levitan. And you can follow me on Twitter at Matt F. The Oracle. I'm Matt Freedman. And this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.